And there are certain carriers that have better inventory, but ultimately is that it's been really tight. The supply's been tight, but the reason is that demand seems to be better than what people had thought. And just, it's always hard to figure out which is what driving. And ultimately is one thing we can do is just measure at the Apple stores how much inventory that they have of phones. And so typically 2 months after a product launch, they should have about 100% of the SKUs in. And right now it's about 60%. And so it's still lagging. It's surprisingly 2 months after the product release, it's still not widely available.
Are there certain components in the iPhone 6 and 6 Plus that suggest to you that it's not a supply issue, that they're sort of commonly available?
Well, the components that they have, well, I think the components are relatively easy, and based on some of the comments that Apple had on their last conference call, they didn't seem to say that there was any issues that they had on the production side, and so there wasn't anything that was dramatic on the component side. And then, as of the third week in October, things were fine. So, unless something really short-circuited in the last few weeks, which is unlikely, I think this is probably driven by continued healthy demand.
Is the 6 Plus worse in terms of supply than the 6? And what does that mean for Apple's margins?
Well, more recently, we've actually seen the 6 Plus supply improving, and the 6 supply is actually tighter. And what we think is going on is that if you look at the early adopters tend to spend a little bit more and get the bigger form factor. And I think we're starting to slowly drift back into more mainstream. And I think that that's probably why you're seeing a little bit better availability of the 6 Plus and a little bit tighter availability of the 6. And so ultimately, if down the road a year from now, it's probably going to be 60 to 70% of units are going to be the smaller iPhone 6.
And that smaller margin?
The margin's comparable. The gross margin's comparable. It might be fractionally lower, but the gross profit dollars are less with the 6 because the ASP is lower. And so in Apple's case, they'd be happy to sell you either one, but they'd probably be more happy to sell you a 6 Plus.
I'm glad I was there for Tim Cook. I know he needs me. But does this matter for Apple? I mean, were they going to sell everything they made during this quarter anyway? Or do you think this is material enough that they're going to actually have a much better quarter than expected and sell more fans and put more phones in the hands of their users?
Well, there's a governing factor on how big the December quarter can be, and that's the supply side. So I think that the idea of having some gangbuster December is probably not a reality. I think that that's consistent with what their guidance was. They probably had a good sense of what they could produce when they gave that guidance back in October. The reason why this is important is that this really pushes the cycle into 2015. And for investors, that's the big question, is when to get off based on when the peak of the cycle is. And so having another potentially strong quarter with the March quarter is something that's material for investors.